So the subtitle for this paper is Acoustic Mayhem in Geoffrey's Dream. One of Chaucer's earliest works, House of Fame, was composed sometime between 1379 and 1380, while the poet worked as controller for the wool custom at the port of London. Like Dante's Commedia and Macrobius's commentary on Cicero's Somnium Scipionis, House of Fame recounts a vision of philosophical flight, as Chaucer's rotund narrator, Geoffrey, is taken on a cosmic journey by an eagle that promises to show him tidings of love. Whilst Dante's poem envisions the prospects of Christian afterlife, and Macrobius explores the nature of the divine through Cicero's perception of cosmic travel, Chaucer's dreamer ventures to territories more irreverent than spiritual, as Alistair Minnis summates. Chaucer's eagle soars not to heavenly regions of immutable truth and total certainty, but to gossip-filled dwellings of rumour and dubious reportage. On the 10th of December, the narrator, a composer of books, songs and ditties, is transported from his silent and lacklustre studies to a dream world full of colour, noise and animation. Upon finding himself in a temple made of glass, awash with vibrant images of classical heroes and lovers, the bookish Geoffrey is carried by an eagle sent by Jupiter to the cacophonous and chaotic palace of Lady Fame. To find inspiration, the eagle tells Geoffrey for his love poems, seeing as the narrator doesn't have much experience in that department himself. Geoffrey's first journeys to the castle of Lady Fame, filled with clamour of throngs of poets, lovers, and musicians seeking the capricious goddess's favour, and then to the house of rumour, a whirling, spinning structure more complex than Daedalus' labyrinth and more raucous than a Roman mob. The narrative abruptly ends with Geoffrey's introduction to a man of great authority. The progression from Geoffrey's silent and solitary study to the tumultuous experience of the dream world is punctuated by the dreamer's fascination and bewilderment at the bedlam of sounds that inhabit the space beyond his contemplative life spent in books, where he was oblivious even to the tidings of his neighbours living at his doorstep, which, if we were attending to Professor Strong's paper yesterday, I don't know how he could have been oblivious to the sounds outside his doorstep. Geoffrey compares the clamour and chatter in Lady Fame's palace to the tempestuous beating of the sea, when the eagle informs him of the great sound that rumbleth up and down in the famous house, full of tidings both of fair speech and chidings, and of false and soft compound. Now asked by the eagle what the mixture of true and false tidings and foul and fair speech sounded like to him, the bewildered Geoffrey responds, Peter, like the beating of the sea. The House of Rumour exposes the dreaming Geoffrey to a soundscape even more confusing and overwhelming than that of the Palace of Fame. The wooden structure rings and jangles with tidings of war and peace, life and death, love and hate, health and sickness, trust and envy, folly and famine, and many other things whispered and roared all at once. The sound of the curious collection of gigs, chirpings, and gossip is so loud, remarks Geoffrey, that had it come from the banks of the river Oise in northern France, it would have easily been heard in Rome. Once taken by the eagle from the temple of glass, there seemed to never be a peaceful moment for the dreaming Geoffrey. If he is not marvelling at the processions of music, minstrelry, and guileless petitions in Fame's castle, aghast at Aeolus' trumpeting heraldry of tidings of good and bad fame, or confounded by the maelstrom of hearsay and obscure whisperings in the House of Rumour, he is the recipient of one of the eagle's many long-winded and voluble speeches. Never more irreverently are we made aware of the supremacy of noise in Chaucer's House of Fame than in a moment which may be regarded as one of the most elaborate jokes on the subject of flatulence in the history of the English language. Wordy Eagle, in one of his many discursive lectures, explains to Geoffrey how news travels to the House of Fame by the air, explaining that noises are formed by wavelengths and vibrations caused by movements of air, asserting sound is naught but air broken, and every speech that is spoken, louder privy, fouler fair, in its substance is but air, for the flamme is but lighted smoke, right so sound as air broke. The eagle explains that as all sounds and all things that are said are but air, they arise by their very nature and travel upward to the House of Fame, which stands between heaven, the earth and the sea. Understandings of the physics of sound as movement of air are, as Alistair Innes asserts, the staple fare of the medieval grammar school. Such works as Vincent de Beauvais' Speculum Naturale and Priscian's Institution Grammaticae circulated this explanation of sound widely to literate audiences of the Middle Ages, and those versed in theories of music would have been familiar with the idea from such works as Boethius's De Institutione Musica, which was Chaucer's most likely source for information on the subject, as is indicated by commentaries on the multiplication of sound waves and analogies to pebbles creating waves thrown in water. Whilst Vincent de Beauvais, Priscian and Boethius argue that the pulsation of air is what generates sound and thus speech, Chaucer's eagle instead infers that broken air is in fact the very substance of sound, that every word spoken is nothing more than broken air. In this reductio ad absurdum, the eagle lampoons medieval scholars of grammar and music on the subject of the physics of sound and provokes readers to question the authority and estimate of all that is said and heard in the Soundscape of House of Fame. Consequently, although Geoffrey's journey from secluded contemplation to experience of sight and sound, observing the images of the glass temple and listening to the eagle's digressions, is often interpreted as a path to personal expression, as the dreaming Geoffrey ultimately rejects the repute of literary authority, stating that he has little desire for fame and would be content for his name to die with him. The tempting analogy of progression from dependence on old books to real-life experience for poetic inspiration is a questionable one. Considering the ambivalent and irreverent presentation of representatives of sound in the House of Fame, for example, the cacophony of light and lewd musicians attending a famous palace, of which there are, according to Geoffrey, more than stars be in heaven, which has often received attention for what is regarded as Chaucer's combination of classical and contemporary sources, literary authority and real-life experience. They're little to elevate either musicians of classical literature or of medieval Europe in this account. Geoffrey recounts here in both legendary and contemporary musicians playing simultaneously in chaos of intermingled melodies and instruments. Orpheus, the icon of ancient music, plays harp alongside Chaucer's contemporary, the Northern Welsh bard Gwydion. The legendary satyr Marsyas and the biblical Joab play in accompaniment to Dutch pipers learning love dances, and Spanish clarinets playing music more suited to a battlefield. As early as 1930, John Livingston Lowes remarked that when he wrote the gorgeous Phantasmagoria of House of Fame, Chaucer's details derived not only from his reading but also from what he had seen and heard. And following this train of thought, Roland Smith noted that records indicate that Chaucer's benefactor, John of Gaunt, employed Dutch pipers and Spanish clarinets as part of his revenue. In the decade preceding the composition of House of Fame, we find documents in the Duke's Register naming Hans Gach and Henry Buttensgram pipers, and alongside Johanna of Buckingham, we have a very suggestively Spanish name, James Sanchez, as clarinet, likely part of the retinue of John II, Duchess Constance of Castile. By placing Orpheus alongside musical attendants of John of Gaunt, Chaucer draws inspiration from both literary and real-life experience, but whether intended to elevate Gwydion and Dutch pipers by placing them alongside Orpheus, or to debase classical icons of music making by associating them with these contemporaries, and also alongside minstrels, jesters, jugglers, magicians, illusionists, and other makers of revelry, is uncertain. The minstrels with which classical and contemporary music makers are associated receive little favour from those who would have been educated enough to appreciate the eagle's pompously pedantic pun on the sound of breaking air. Minstrels, jonglers, and jesters provided bawdy and lewd entertainment as opposed to the inspiration for high art that we expect to find in the House of Fame. Scorned by theorists of music such as Boethius and equally by poets, The attitude to minstrels in the circles which Chaucer traversed is perhaps best expressed by his contemporary Petrarch, who refers to the entertainers as men of no great parts, but with great powers of memory, great industry, and still greater impudence, who frequent the halls of kings and great men, with not a rag of their own to cover their nakedness, but tricked out in the trappings of other men's songs, and who earn noblemen's favour by their declamatory recitations of this or that man's best compositions, especially of those that are written in the vulgar tongue. Given the prevalent attitude, equally reflected in Chaucer's own unflattering portrayals, often unflattering portrayals of musicians elsewhere, such as his Bawdy Miller, how might we read references to such iconic literary figures as Orpheus alongside such contemporary How might we read references to such iconic literary figures as Orpheus alongside the contemporaries, pipers and clariners attendant to John Gaunt as makers of minstrelry? Instead of advocates of the highly regarded science of musica, one of the quadrivium sciences of ars mathematicae, we are instead provided with makers of love dances and battle tunes, who sing, as Petrarch comments, in vulgar tongue. By vulgar, Petrarch means the vernacular, subordinate to Latin, the language of learning and ecclesiastical life, the same tongue but with which the poetry of Chaucer, Boccaccio, Guglielmo, and so many more was composed as throughout Europe literacy became more widespread, and those tastes became more unrefined. The change in audience may well have motivated the move away from scholastic contemplation to entertainment for the masses, as appreciations of music transformed from ars mathematicae to minstrelry, and the purpose of dream poetry from didactic and educational visions such as Dante's to the raucous and ribald exploits of Chaucer's House of Fame. It is clear from the vulgar language and vulgar sounds of Geoffrey's dream vision that it is intended to entertain rather than elevate its readers. The sense that we are not to take either erudition or experience too seriously is further emphasised through House of Fame's noisiness if we consider how frequently music and sound are employed by the word ego to explain things to the obtuse Geoffrey. In addition to the commotion of sounds of the cosmos, the eagle's absurd arguments, the rabble of musicians of Fame's castle, Aeolus's foul trumpet, and the whirring chirping sounds of Rumour's spinning house, further noise is added to this confounding soundscape by ironic allusions to music, sound, and silence in the eagle's digressions. The eagle repeatedly uses either music or sound as a means to explain matters to the dreaming Geoffrey, euphemistically acknowledging that the bookish dreamer is part of the dance of those unlucky in love, and complaining that he stays in his books until he is silent as a stone, and later informs Geoffrey that there are more love days and reconciliations than strings on musical instruments. If we bear in mind the eagle's statement of intention to suit subject matter to audience, in which he claims to educate Geoffrey by speaking lewdly to a lewd man, the sense that sound and noise might supersede literary authority is at a loss. The acoustic atmosphere of Chaucer's House of Fame is one of absolute chaos and irreverence. Within the clamour of noises and mingled voices, it is hard to know how the dreaming Geoffrey might hear tidings of love or find poetic inspiration among the throng of discordant and indistinct sounds. But like the ambiguously abrupt ending of the poem, the unintelligibility of House of Fame soundscape is part of its appeal. Alistair Minns brings to our attention the sense that Chaucer was deliberately making his poem difficult, as this uncompromisingly intellectual work evinces a labyrinthine aesthetic. Hopefully you'll be able to see enough of this for me to use it as an example. The same aesthetic was typical in music of the period, as the dominating form of secular art music was the motet, a multi-voiced piece in which a number of texts were sung to a number of melodies and often in a number of languages simultaneously. This example is motet number 8 by Chaucer's contemporary Guglielmo, which, although it doesn't contemplate Lady Fame, it does pay respects to her sister Fortune. It exemplifies the aesthetic of multi-voiced abstruseness in music which is echoed in the complexity of sounds in House of Fame. The first two voices, if you can see the illuminated Q at the top and then the H, are from secular French texts, quia promises de fortune and half fortune, trop Sweden long, and then at the bottom, very small declaration there is marks out a tenor text in Latin, et non excui adjuve. Those three texts were all sung at once to different melodies. So, in the simultaneity of sounds, it was quite difficult for the hearer to discern one voice or one text, one thing being said from the other. Sorry for the example, I'm going to abbreviate a bit. Pope John the 22nd's 1324 bull Dona Sanctorum Patrum, teachings of the Holy Father, berates this style of music, saying that certain exponents of a new school who are composing new melodies of their own creation with a new system of notes as these they prefer to ancient and traditional music, the melodies of the church. By some, their melodies are robbed of their virility by adding a second and third text or dangerous elements produced by singing certain parts in the vernacular. These musicians run without passing, they intoxicate the ear without satisfying it. Instead of promoting devotion, they prevent it by creating a sensuous and innocent atmosphere. Mixing secular vernacular songs with sacred Gregorian chant was prevalent among Michaud and his contemporaries, and it embodies the same reverence and treatment of authority that is seen in the minstrel status of Orpheus and the new treatment of music theory in House of Fame. And like the motet, House of Fame evinces a labyrinthine aesthetic of ambiguity, concealing any voice of learning or instruction in absolute confusion of simultaneous noises and discordant voices. And the fact that the great man of authority of House of Fame that intends to make sense of this chaotic dream for us appears in the House of Rumour, the most noisome and raucous soundscape of all, is at the least to say ironic. In his superlative study of another of Chaucer's clamorous texts, The Nun's Priest's Tale, Peter Travis remarks that Chaucer is fascinated by the resistance of noise to our understanding. The sound and the fury of Geoffrey's dream vision embraces the same aesthetic of complexity, and subsequently bewilders the reader. The soundscape of House of Fame intoxicates the ear, robbing virility from any didactic message about authority or life experience that we might discern in it, among the continuous distraction of infinite simultaneously sounding noises. Though typically a dream vision from an eagle would be evoked to immutable truth and revelation, Geoffrey's eagle instead takes us to acoustic mayhem, irreverent and noisy chaos, as literary and learned authority, love tidings, life experiences, and the experts on the chaotic science of sound are all muffled by the immutable racket of noises' resistance to comprehension.